Good morning. I'm your main MC for today, Emily Coatlier. It's great to be here at the TCANS conference introducing our first keynote speaker, Saul Carliner. This is a man who kept all of us absolutely fascinated yesterday in a conference room through 2 workshop sessions. He's based at Concordia University in Montreal, where he's director of the Education Doctoral Program and an associate professor of educational technology. His teaching and research focus on designing content for communication and learning for the workplace, managing the groups that produce this content, and transferring research results to the real world. He's the author of 8 books. He's received 5 awards for his articles in the journal Technical Communication. He serves on the boards of the Canadian Society for Training and the development of the STC Certification Commission. And he's here to talk to us today about the future of the technical communication brand. Please, everyone, welcome Saul Carliner.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. No, that's not good morning. Good morning, everyone. One more time like you're really here. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's the first day of the conference. You really have got to be here, mentally and physically. We're here today to talk about the future of the technical communication brand. And to give you a little idea, I hope, there are a number of different brands out there. This one should look somewhat familiar, the Apple. How about this one? How about them? How about that? Believe it or not, even a country. Apparently, according to some branding experts, Canada, the country where I now live, is apparently the best branded country in the world. What that means exactly, I don't know. But the truth is technical communication also has a brand. We've got TCANS, of course, TCOM, and moving out of the T category, STC. So what exactly is a brand? According to the Wikipedia, the brand is a personality that identifies a particular product or service or company and how it relates to the key constituencies. So it's a bunch of different things. It's more than these symbols that I showed you a moment ago, but it's also all of the feelings and thoughts and impressions that come with that name, the brand. So let me ask you, what do you think is the personality of technical communication? What is our brand? So take a moment and just write down some thoughts. If you have a pen and paper, write it that way. If not, you can mentally write that down. But what is the personality of the technical communication brand? Write down single words that describe the characteristics of who we are. You may want to look at it from 2 perspectives. What do you think we think of ourselves? And what do you think others think of ourselves? I feel like I played Stump the Student right now, looking at some of the facial expressions. All right. I want to see what your thoughts are. Anybody want to share a thought about what is the personality of our brand? Some characteristics, a word or an expression that characterizes. Yes. Serious. Can you explain why you say that? That's good. I'd like to hear the why. We're endeavoring to be accurate and reliable. In that process, we're very serious. Other words that come to mind. What? Informative. You want to explain a little bit about that? The main purpose is to communicate about a subject to other people. Very good. Other thoughts? What? Passionate. Explain that one. We're in it for a reason, aren't we? Focused on clarity. Explain that a little bit. We get the message across. Yeah. Reliable. Explain what you mean by that. You say you're going to do something and you're going to do it. Any other words that come to mind? Detailed. Explain. Through detail, you can create clarity. Actually, detail is a very important word, as we'll find out in a few moments. Yeah. Inquisitive. Explain. Ask people what they do, how they're doing it, finding out. Because if you don't know for yourself, how can you share with others? Any other words that are coming to mind? Yeah. User-focused. You want to explain that one? I think it may be self-evident, but just in case. Anybody have anything negative? Yeah. Give me a positive first, then we're going to go negative.
The positive one is helpers.
Helpers.
To make everyone else's day go better.
Our job is to make people's days go better. So we're helping people. Anything negative that you can come up with? Yeah. Invisible. Talk about that.
Well, we're back office.
We're back office. We're hidden behind lock and key of either virtual or real sort. Other negatives. Yeah. Complex. How so? We can be both positive and negative. Other negatives. Pedantic. Explain. That's a great word, isn't it? Last syllables. Yep. Overly fussy about details. Would you say that's true? Oh, yes. Oh, yes, I heard up here. Anything else? Any other negatives? Well, sorry, we got this one and then this one. Judgmental. That's a really negative one. Explain. Grammar. It's not that just we pick on it. We think about what you are based on your grammar. Okay, we're solid, which has positive and negatives. All right, anything else anybody wants to add? What? Necessary. Explain. Okay. They have to give us out whether they like it or not. In some products, you can't even think of selling a product without the documentation. We're not something people choose to do. We're things, it's like being stuck with a relative that you can't get rid of, and you have to invite them to dinner. We had this aunt and uncle. We always used to have to invite to holiday dinners. And some of those holidays would follow my sister's birthday. And she would deal with her anger by taking the napkin and tearing it into tiny little bits. And by the end of the evening, to say it was confetti would be to overstate the size of the little pieces of napkin, how much she detested that moment. Anything else that you can think of? 1, 2, yes. Tend to presume. We tend to presume what we did last time. We're not good at marketing ourselves. How do these resonate with you guys? These words. They seem to say, yeah, the positives seem pretty right. The negatives seem, I don't love them, but yeah, they probably are. There's a point there. Or you say, these colleagues of mine are totally off base. What's the impression of this? What? They seem to resonate? Yeah, they're about right? Yeah? Well, let me share a couple of different it's interesting how we view ourselves. Because we do have some brand identities out there. Anybody read Dilbert? If you don't, it's kind of about life in the office. And one of the recurring characters in Dilbert is Tina, the brittle technical communicator. And how do I put this? She's more of the extreme on the negative side. Very brittle, not really open to criticism, kind of introverted, kind of not the most pleasant person you would ever deal with, kind of a grammar Nazi, just not the kind of person you really love to deal with. Well, several years ago, when I was finishing up my term on the board of the Society for Technical Communication, we tried to do a branding exercise, and what we wanted to do was say, we knew about Tina at the time, and it's like, we don't want to be Tina. We want to really kind of be more outward bound about who we are and what it is that we do. And we went through a branding company, and they came up with a new brand identity for us. They wanted to turn us into from Tina, the brittle technical communicator, to Lisa Simpson. And the idea was, Lisa's kind of a quirky human being. She's bright. She's got enthusiasm. She's willing to try new challenges. One of the things they said, Tina, the brittle technical communicator, dressed a particular way, and I really don't see anybody dressed quite as Tina. Sensible shoes and a stretch polyester suit. And what they wanted to do is come up with something. Lisa's definitely in something a little bit more, how do I put this, hip than that. But what we've got here is a very different kind of brand identity. The sad reality is that there was a huge change in leadership after Lisa was supposed to become our brand identity at STC, and nothing really ever went with the project except for a new logo. But one of the things that really becomes important is, and that's really kind of a fundamental problem, is that a lot of the issues when it comes to branding, it's not about what you want and you want and you want and you want, or what TCANS wants, or what TCOM wants, or what STC wants. A couple things about branding. It's got to be a shared vision of who and what we are, and we have to work together in order to communicate that vision to other people. Someone said we're not really that good at marketing ourselves. And in fact, we don't share anything about ourselves with other people. And that creates some sort of challenges for us. And what I want to talk about now is, this morning, a little bit first about how we evolved as a profession and how we got to where we are today. And then I want to talk about some of the challenges for us as a brand. I know that the keynote tomorrow is going to be talking about us in relation to other professions of communication. I'm actually going to be touching on the same topic today, because when we think about branding technical communication, one of the things what we're really saying is how are we different than any other brand of communication in the field? Because whether we purposely create a brand or whether we just kind of let a brand happen to us, people do have perceptions about what we are and what we do. And they may be the ones we want them to have, and they may not be. They may be correct or they may be incorrect. And it's only by taking stock of where that is can we begin to think about where we're going to head. So what I'd like to do now is take a little time to talk about where are we going as a profession and where have we been. So I want to start talking, first of all, technical communication has had very different identities throughout the years. And believe it or not, there are samples of technical communication that go back thousands and thousands of years. In the new museum in Berlin, for example, they have these beautiful ancient papyruses with all kinds of exciting written documentation there. And some of them are really kind of instructions on how to do things and documentation of various, what we would call hardware and software, obviously a little different back in those times before they had computers. There's a wonderful article that was published several years ago about the evolution of Chinese cookbooks and how they increasingly adopted a user focus and adapted to the user's needs over time. There was some testimony given to the U.S. Congress in 1859 where they credited the saving of lives through the lighthouses across the shores of the U.S. because the people that ran those lighthouses had great instructions. And then there was someone who wrote about all of the sewing machines that had been developed in the turn of the last century, from the 19th to the 20th century, and how they documented all of the instructions in books. And she was talking about how her research looked at how they perpetuated gender stereotypes through this particular type of documentation. But what was interesting is all of those, what made them different from what we do now, all of those technical communicators were not what you are, because they were people who were either technical experts who were told they had to write something or felt that they had to write something just to get something done, or in the last case, they were someone who was trained as a writer, a general writer, who got employment basically writing up the instructions for how to do a sewing machine. The modern practice of technical communication really begins around World War II. And it's that period where we begin talking about our history. And I've kind of got this little build slide here that talks about the history of the field and how we've developed. And you'll find that there are some developments in technical communication actually correspond to different developments both in the economy and technology. And some of the technological developments have to do with who we are the technologies that affect the work that we do directly, and some of the technology developments affect what we're writing about. And if you look at pre-1950s, you've got the post-war economic boom, and you've got the start of modern communications going on there in terms of the technological developments. In addition, what's going on at that time, you have a lot of commercialization of the technology that had developed during World War II. And we were looking, and most of it was industrial. It was not personal. And in addition, a lot of that technology was very complex, and it required that people write about it. And that was one of the first time they start seeing people who are writing about this technology say, I want to be recognized as a member. And it's very interesting. Technical communicators were already joining in with other people in other professions. And yesterday I gave a workshop on instructional design for e-learning. What people don't realize is the history of relationships between the training profession and technical communication actually is very formal and goes back a long time. Because the original STC was actually an offshoot of a group called the American Society for Training and Development, or ASTD, which is the world's largest professional association for training and development professionals. So we were actually an offshoot, and until very recently, the executive directors of the two organizations were always very close colleagues and close personal friends. And I'm not saying that there's not that there's animosity. It's just over the years they've grown apart, they've gotten new leadership, and they've since moved apart from that. When we move into the 1950s, what we have are the post-war economic boom is continuing, and the early tabulating machines, this would be like the early IBM machines, early Rayovac machines, they start hitting the market. Again, extremely complex products, all intended primarily for the industrial market, business-to-business kind of stuff, requiring highly technical things. And we see the actual, and then the growth in the employment of technical communicators grows, and the emergence of a separate professional identity, where something different. And you see the founding of two groups that are really important. The first one is the IEEE Professional Communications Society. And that's, if you're not familiar with the IEEE, that is the professional association for electrical and electronic engineers and most computer scientists. Others belong to the ACM, or the Association for Computing Machinery. And so the fact that there's a special interest group within that large engineering world just on communication is pretty significant. And that group still exists to this day. The second one is the predecessor organization to STC is founded. And so this all happens in the 1950s. One of the other things happens around here is who is being hired for the job. Usually it's people who are already technical professionals, and at the same time, they have an interest in communicating, and sometimes because they really have an interest in communicating. And the sad fact is, some of them is because they were really bad at technology. Companies had a philosophy of lifetime employment, so they moved them into another job, and they thought, well, maybe they'll succeed at this one. And so we have some interesting issues starting from our earliest days. The other thing that happens in the 1950s is the first academic programs in technical communication were established. The first one was at Carnegie Mellon, and then we see the schools, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York and the University of Minnesota in St. Paul all had programs by the end of the 1950s. In the 1960s, in our little continuing trip down memory lane, we see high growth and low inflation, great economy, because we're still kind of at the tail end of this economic boom. In terms of publishing technology, it's not that it was developed during the 60s, but it really began to take off. It's something called offset printing. How many people here are familiar with that term, offset printing? If you're not familiar with it, and if you ever go down, in fact, there's an example in the Auckland Museum. They have an old-fashioned printing press. And they used to literally have to set every letter, one letter at a time. It was a whole profession. In fact, it was a grand profession that lasted for about several hundred years. And then there was this development called offset printing. And basically what they did was you just typed everything up on a typewriter, a very clean piece of paper with really white, really dark black letters. And then they took a snapshot, well, not a really good photograph of it. And from that, they would develop the printing plate, which really completely eliminated the typesetting profession, at least that kind of typesetting. And it significantly reduced both the time to print and the cost of printing. And now all of a sudden, companies can start producing a whole lot more content for the same printing budget, which meant they could hire more tech writers, and at the same time, they could put out a lot more content, which is good, because we also see the rise of other kinds of new communication vehicles. E-learning may be new to many of you, but the first e-learning emerged, believe it or not, in the late 1960s. And one of the leading names in e-learning today was involved in the development of an authoring system back then called Plato. So we have a long history in some of the things we think are new. Other thing we find is, remember in the 50s I said we had the early tabulating machines? Well, now at this point in time, we're moving into the early mainframe computers. And in fact, one of the major developments of the 1960s is the emergence of the IBM 360. Not because it was the most technologically advanced computer, but because it was the most commercially successful computer of its type. And there were a number of things learned in how they designed and developed that computer that still guide the way we do project management in high tech today. So what happens to our field? Well, probably what you see is you're seeing the emergence of a niche profession that's just focused on communicating technical information. We see a few more academic associations formed. We see a few more professional associations. And at the same time, we're just slowly but successfully moving. And what we see in the next 2 to 3 decades is an explosion. 1970s really was marked by something called stagflation, which means stagnant economy, high inflation, lousy economic conditions. That's the bad news. The good news is it didn't stop the development of technology or the need for technical communication. And so you see a huge growth in software and telecommunications industries. Because people were buying this kind of equipment, it did promise to make workers more efficient and effective. You also see towards the end of the decade, the very first word processors. Now, the very first, anybody seen a word processor called Scribe or ISIL? You actually have. How many people here have seen HTML code? Believe it or not, the codes that I learned with Scribe in 1980, a paragraph was .p. Not a whole lot different than this P now. List item was li.li. Now it's li. So in other words, everything that we work with today in HTML, and if you go down to pure, down and dirty, adorned HTML, believe it or not, has its roots back there. So when we think about, oh my God, we're doing all this new stuff, a lot of this stuff has actually been around for a long time, because most people don't know there was. We also see the founding of the German organization TCOM at that point. At the same time, they're not the only national organization that forms in Europe, and TCOM was not as big as it was now because almost every European country had its own technical communication organization. I believe that the Australian organization was founded about that time, and we start seeing sometime between the late 60s and the mid 80s, almost all of the technical communication professional associations that we know of today have been founded. But the TCOM is kind of significant because of their growth later. We move into the 1980s, and this was the boom years. This is when I joined the profession. You see the rise of supply-side economics. Like it or not, one thing we can honestly say is by the mid-1980s, the economic engine was on fire, and economic growth was happening. We also see at the beginning of the 1980s, the emergence of the personal computer as a viable commercial product. Didn't develop. Apple came out with its products in the 70s. Other people came out with them in the 70s. But when IBM popularized the PC in 1981, that's when it took over. And so what you see is it's not just the rise of PC itself, but all the applications that go with it. And they all were trying to get, and this is the first time their assumption was the people that are going to be using computers are not going to be specially trained. We're going to have to use self-study, or we're going to have to use manuals, and that's going to have to do the job. And so there was a huge growth in the need for people to write end-user documentation because nobody was willing to spend money on training. I'm not saying nobody at all, but I'm just saying for every one person that got training, there were probably 4 to 5 that were not going to get training, and they had to learn somehow how to use these devices they never had. In terms of publishing, we see further refinements in the publishing side of it, but for us, the big deal was the rise of word processing in the form of WYSIWYG. Most people didn't, if they saw a code like :P and LI and /P, that was going to scare the living daylights out of them. And when you get WordPerfect, a product that will be there in history, even though it doesn't live much anymore, they were the ones to first really popularize the idea, you don't need all those weird codes. You can just type it and do it. The problem was they had 16 million shift keys that you had to learn how to use it, and when the GUI interfaces came about, they kind of died. But that really was a huge thing. other thing that happened was the rise of desktop publishing. Now we could cut the entire production department out. That's the labor implication. But the good news was we could save so much money that the writer could now become their own production staff member. And with the wonders of clip art, they became an artist. We were like Renaissance people, all through the wonders of desktop publishing and word processing. What happens here is there were some major changes in the profession. First of all, STC really started growing substantially. We had 10 to 15% membership growth every single year through the late 1990s. We can guarantee it. Our conferences went from a few hundred people to several thousand people. And there were corresponding changes on the other side of the Atlantic, and as I understand it, on this side of the Pacific. We even see the rise of technical communication in Japan, Korea, and to a small extent even in China, which has grown since then. So we see a lot of emergence of the field. The other thing is we see a huge demographic shift. In the early 1980s and before, most technical communicators had technical backgrounds. They generally either had a high school education or they had some technical college. A few had a bachelor's degree, but most of them were also very male. By the 1980s, we're hiring journalism and English graduates who have bachelor's degrees, and now the profession moved from being predominantly male to predominantly female. And so you see a very different kind of technical communicator emerge. Tina the brittle technical communicator and Lisa Simpson could never have been our brand identity in the 70s because they were not representative of even a small percentage of our membership in the field. So I think that's pretty significant there. Now as we move closer to the current time, the 1990s, I would say the best thing I could say about the economics in that era was there was belief in perpetual good times. And you may have some of you may remember there was there's no need to worry about an economic slowdown. I even almost fell for that. It's like I just thought the law of what goes up must come down, must work. But there were people, there were economic specialists that said you don't have to worry about the economic cycle anymore. We're insulated from it. Something we learned about otherwise very soon afterwards. You see the rise of the cellular phone industry and the internet, and this fueled additional opportunity for us. There were some good things and bad things, because most of these ventures were funded by something called venture capital, which meant they just had to have an idea and be able to sell the idea, and if they were successful, they had the money to operate for a few years. Many of these people, in addition, unfortunately, didn't really have a plan for making any money. And at some point, when you don't make money, you can't stay in business. And that comes to haunt us in the following decade. We went from slowdown at the beginning to this perpetual growth at the end. And then finally, in terms of our field, some of the developments that happened. The first thing is what we call the value studies. And there aren't that many, but in the mid-1990s, STC funded a number of studies to find out what is the unique value added by technical communicators. And I'm going to come back to that point in a little bit. But it's the first time we ever really asked the question, are we offering value to the people that are paying for our salaries or paying our fees if we're external? Because if we're not, why would people hire us? So this issue of why would someone spend money on us, the financial and business side of our work, is starting to emerge in the profession. You also see the very, very first certification programs for technical communicators emerging in the late 1990s. When I see the very first certification programs, most of them are not directly in tech comm. They're really in the field of training and development. But some of them are very relevant to us. For example, there's the Certified Technical Trainer program that has been offered by a number of different organizations because apparently they can't seem to make a profit off of it, so they keep selling it. But that certification is still around, and it's a very relevant one for those of us who are pure technical communicators but also work in the classroom. Almost through our little history here. In the 2000s, remember I said in the previous decade we thought we had perpetual growth. We learned almost the second everything turned. We were worried about all the computers blowing up because of the millennium problem. What we didn't expect was the economy would blow up. And in the process of blowing up, it blew up a couple of the industries that we really, really relied on. Our partners in all other branches of communication really took a hit. They took it twice in the decade. The first one was the beginning when there was a drop in advertising dollars. And so, and plus the drop in all of these internet startup companies. Most of them imploded in about 2000 to 2002, and a lot of them relied heavily on a lot of hype offered by public relations and marketing companies. And they lost all of these billings, and a lot of people were out of work. Later in the decade, in terms of technology, what we see is the rise of social media and content management. Again, these aren't necessarily concepts that were entirely new, but what happened was the new social media, things like Facebook and LinkedIn, they made it a lot easier to connect to people than the internet already had done. And believe it or not, until social media, many of us believed that what we already had made us far more connected. But when we saw what social media could do, it's like, nah, that wasn't enough. This is the right thing. We also see going on content management. We see, first of all, the volume of content growing substantially. That's great. And we had to control it. The first content management systems actually appeared several decades earlier, but they were not in wide use. Some of them were not even sold on the market. And they didn't do a lot of the things the ones we have. So we see content management come up now. It becomes more commonplace. And the other thing is it changes some of the relationships we have with who contributes content and how. And finally, we start seeing a couple of other things. TCOM, which is the German Technical Communication Organization, is on the rise. And they announced this certificate program. They call it certification, and I'll talk a little bit more later. They're not the same thing. They have a certificate program, and that's the legal definition of what they offer. But it's pretty substantial. You go through 18 months of a program, I believe, and you complete a capstone experience. And should you pass, you have a certificate that says, I am a qualified technical communicator. And this is over and above all of the degree programs offered through the college systems, which they call Fachhochschulen in Germany. STC, on the other hand, is experiencing some major, with the implosion of the communication industry, we see a drop in our membership, which is really kind of disappointing, and a regrouping and a refocusing of our efforts. And that brings us to the current decade. We see the European debt crisis, in addition to the world economic crisis, but this seems to be the one that seems to be behind a lot of it. And as a result, you see a really stagnant economy with very low growth, negative growth in some areas, and that really creates a very troubling economic environment. In terms of technological developments that affect us, probably the most significant at this point is the rise of electronic books or e-books. We, of course, have been working in online information since the 1970s and early 1980s. But we're like the only branch that's really focused exclusively on online content. We start seeing some interest in online content from other providers towards the introduction of the internet era, and very substantially in the 2000s, when a lot of the newspapers had websites. But a lot of the newspapers found out during the economic implosion that, wait a second, people aren't paying for our website, we have no basis for generating ad revenue, and no one's buying our paper, which has always bankrolled everything else. We have a problem here. And when Apple brought out the iBooks store in addition to the iPad, the iBook store was supposed to be the savior of the publishing industry, because now they could stop having people go to websites. They could provide a more premium experience on the iPad, and people would want to subscribe to newspapers through the iPad and similar devices. That's still the wish. I can't tell you that that's actually proven to be true, but you see more stuff happening. You also see something else going on. We see STC developing a certification. And a certificate, as I said, is different than a certification. A certificate is completion of an educational requirement. That's the technical definition of it. Certification is validation of competence by a third party. And so what STC has launched is a new certification program that allows your competence to be validated by a third party in a series of competencies or skill areas that has been pre-decided. And if you pass, then you can use a bunch of letters by your name. And they are CPTC, if you're wondering what they are, Certified Professional Technical Communicator. And so that has literally just been launched this year. And it'll be very interesting to see how the different certifications exist in the marketplace. Now that's how our brand is developed. But throughout that history, one of the challenges has been that we have always had difficulty distinguishing our brand. And part of it is external and part of it is internal. But I want to start by talking about the external. There was a study commissioned by a combination of the provinces in Western Canada, funded in part by the STC, but mostly by the government of Canada, where they were trying to say it was one of these value studies, but unlike the other value studies, we're saying, what's the specific value we add in the context of a project? They were looking more broadly, what's the value the technical communicators add in general? So they went to clients of customers who had purchased technical communication services, and they said, were you pleased with the services their tech communicator offered? And almost all of them said, yeah, we thought they were great. And so then they were asked, what's the unique value that they offered in this process? And the respondents said, that's a good question. I have no idea. And that's pretty troubling. If I'm trying to sell a service, and the service is supposed to be unique. I'm a technical communicator. I'm differentiated from a marketing communicator, a general business communicator, an employee communicator, public relations specialist. If we can't say what makes us different and unique in the market, how can we sell our services in that market? Because then anybody can claim to be offering the value that we offer. And that's a pretty significant challenge to have to deal with. And I wanted to spend a few moments now talking about some more of these challenges. The first one is the economic crisis. It continues to pose challenges for us. First of all, some of our long-term sources of employment, at least for the last 2 to 3 decades, are starting to implode. The PC industry, the telecommunications industry. As I mentioned earlier, the entire communication industry has imploded to a large extent because of the problems resulting from the economic crises. First in 2002, and then in 2008 and 2009. In fact, I don't know if you're following this, but a number of newspapers have folded as a result of this. A number of major large communications conglomerates have either filed for bankruptcy or significantly scaled back simply because of the economic crisis. We also see the emergence of something called DIY tools, or do-it-yourself tools, so that people in the community can create their own communication. And in many cases, I hate to say this, it's good. And the reason I hate to say it is because if they're good, that means there's no work opportunity for us. And so that's not good. And so these are some of the challenges that we're facing. But if these are the challenges that are facing us, there are other opportunities being created for us. The first one is that we have the opportunity to refocus from documenting products to integrating products into organizations. Share a real-life story. I shared this in the workshop yesterday, but I think it's really worth repeating for those of you who did not have the opportunity to hear it. So often when we document products and services, especially in software, we say, what are the functions and features? And you just simply document function by function, feature by feature, and you turn everything into a gerund, and you think you have a policy or a procedure. The problem with that is you've documented how to use this function, you've documented how to use this feature, and you've never told anyone how to integrate that into their work. And there was a real case study with someone who was documenting reporting software for a large franchise software application. And the idea was, to put it in really basic plain English, if I'm running a special on lamb burgers at McDonald's, this is currently going on right now here, how is that, someone in marketing may want to look at, how is the lamb burger promotion going on inside the company? Is this going well? Should we extend it? Or is it kind of reaching its peak, and then we should be starting to look at phasing out our lamb burgers and working for the next promotion? So to make that decision, you need a lot of data. The data comes from the individual franchisees. McDonald's here, McDonald's there, McDonald's there. Everywhere in the territory. And then what you do is you upload the data, you look at overall how is this doing, you look at different geographic regions, how this is doing, different parts of town, and you make a call. Is this working well? Well, the way the procedure was documented was, it was all done in one place. Basically, how to enter data, how to print the report, and that was it. The problem is that didn't help anyone, because the data was entered at the franchisee end, in the individual McDonald's stores. Most likely, they would be entered by either an assistant store manager or a store manager. The reports, they wouldn't even look at. The reports were generated in McDonald's headquarters in a marketing department, and they were going to be not just printed. That's really not that hard to do. You pull up the report. If you have to customize it, that's a different story. But just basically, here's the report, print, good luck. That tells you nothing. First of all, you may need to customize that report. And so you need to explain how would what are the options and why would I choose those options. Then when the report is generated, merely saying happy report is kind of useless to the user. They need to understand, how do I interpret that report? What do the different cells mean to me? And to the best of our ability, we need to explain that stuff. And when I say that we have this opportunity to explain how to integrate the technology into organizations, what I'm saying is the time has come to stop documenting functions and features, and the time has come to start saying, my job is to help people integrate this into the job. I'll give you one more example because it's something I'm very, very passionate about. I have students, I teach people to write how-to instructions. And I have students that are former teachers. One of the things they love to write instructions for is how to use these whiteboards. They're very, very smart, or smart boards. And they invariably just say, here's how you turn it on, and here's how you attach it to a computer. I was like, you know what? Teachers aren't that stupid. Most of them can see this button that looks like if you press it, something's going to light up. I bet they can figure it out. And most of them already hook up their PCs to a VGA adapter every day. You're not telling them anything they don't already know. It's not about how to use that toy. That one they can figure out on their own. What they can't figure out is, how do I use that toy to teach math differently than I'm doing now and more effectively? Or teach social studies more effectively than I do now? This is where our challenge becomes. So it's not just enough to know your product. You need to know your industry that you're serving and how people work in those industries. And we keep talking about end users, but we really have to provide them with the stuff that makes the use of the product important in their lives. And it's not just enough to give them instructions in many cases. The more complex the product, the more they need that kind of information. That gets to the next one, creating complex, dynamic, and personalized content. The technology is now available that you can, basically, if you have certain information about your client, your user, you can use that to determine what kind of content would be useful for them, called dynamic content. And you tailored content. The tailored means it's to their profile. The dynamic means it's determined at the time they actually get to the web page. We have the ability to do that, but it's not easy. It's not just about writing the content. It's figuring out who needs which piece of it. Or as one of my colleagues likes to say, you're becoming an information programmer of sorts. There's a lot of DIY or do-it-yourself content out there that others produce. And this translation, what I really mean, is from English to some other language, because most of us are working globally. But there's another type of translation. Believe it or not, I sat in on a master's thesis on translation, and it was from the French department, but they weren't talking about French to English or English to French translation. They were talking to English translation, because technical English and plain English are not the same English. And one of the challenges for translation specialists is, if you're trying to communicate something in plain language, in the target language, and the source language is not plain language, you have to translate it from complex English to plain English before from plain English to plain French or Spanish or whatever. That first translation from complex to plain English, some of that content that's being provided by the community is going to have to be translated into plain English. And that's an opportunity for us. Or as I say, turning it into something comprehensible. But the real untapped opportunity for me is we have a ton of information out there now. The problem is there's a tremendous amount of information overload, and there's a tremendous amount of people being hoodwinked by producing, and if you're not familiar with the hoodwinked, it's a good American expression. It basically means being fooled, treated badly, and basically given a raw deal by people. And the idea is that our job, if we're supposed to be meticulous about advocating for users, the number one thing we should be advocating for, and something we've been doing throughout our whole careers, is clear, understandable, usable, accurate information that's complete. But that's not so easy in an age when there's so much information out there, where it contradicts each other, and everybody wants to get known, and they're more than happy to provide free information. I honestly believe that the information overload will hit a saturation point at some point, and people will be increasingly happy to pay someone to sift through the content for them. And some of it will be done by hand, and some of it will be done by machine. But I think most of us start to reach the breaking point where we can't trust the information that we have. And I think that's where one of our greatest opportunities is. When we talk about that, there's words like content strategy, information architecture, and work like that. And the assumption is that's the height of where our profession is. But there's also an assumption when you read about these in journals and magazines in our field that these are ours for the taking. And I assume that our speaker tomorrow is probably going to elaborate on this. I don't buy that philosophy. I believe that those works, information architecture, content strategy, and similar types of work are actually highly competitive work, and there's a lot of people that would like to do it, partly because it's important, partly because it pays well, and partly because it's just darned interesting work. So a lot of people would want it. And everyone who produces content ultimately is trying to work at that level. We face, our little Lisa Simpson is dealing with competition, first of all, from information technology. And what they have on their side, in terms of competition, is these are the people who control all the systems that get the information out to people in the organization. And it's kind of like being the person who controls the flow of oil. They have a lot of control over the situation, and they certainly can use that to have control over this kind of work. Next, we have the people in training and development. Their advantage is that we tend to focus externally, they tend to focus internally, and even though they don't always do this, there's a great emphasis in the literature on training and development, including instructional design, about the importance of making sure that you involve key business executives in your decision making. Well, at some point, if I want to be doing competitive work, and I know that the IT people and the tech com people and my group all want to compete, and I've got already has the ear of the executives, I'm going to use that ear to try and argue for that work for my group. Then, of course, we've got the public relations, employee communications, or general communications groups within the organization. And they are responsible for the face of the organization, as well as the brand of the organization. And many of them already have the ear of the executive. And so they can argue, this information is really important, and our brand is dependent on how we're presented publicly and even privately. And so one of the things, we're probably best suited to do that work. So when we talk about why branding is so important to technical communication, because when we look at where our opportunity really lies, it's here. And not every single person is going to be the one doing that work, but the kind of work that we all get to work with really depends on how effectively we can sell this kind of operation to the people that need to make the decisions. So what I'd like to do is talk about, well, if we're going to be having to compete for that work, how does it look? And so this is a pretty complex chart. And basically what I look at is, what are our assets and what are our liabilities here? And this is my individual personal assessment. You are more than welcome to disagree, to enhance, to agree, whatever. So it's just one person's assessment. That's all it is. So we look at where are our assets and where are our liabilities. Entry into the field. We have a limited advantage because there's really no limits to who can enter the field of technical communication. If anybody can say I'm a technical communicator, and as long as somebody else is willing to pay the bill, they're in the field. Whether they're good or not is not the issue. But how you get in there, it's just about selling yourself in the field. And by the way, one of the challenges that we also have is a lot of people don't know how to effectively hire technical communicators. So if they don't know the right questions to ask, they're going to get whatever they ask for. Common methodologies. What a common methodology really is that we have a method that everybody uses so that when you go from one organization to the next, there's something specific and unique to this particular type of communication, and in theory, it provides an advantage. Training has something called the ADDIE process, which is a design and development process for creating courses. Corporate communications has very consistent measurement policies, and it's not just limited to one corporation, it's the entire marketing and direct marketing industry out there that uses it. Usability it's not consistent, but they're really growing in the area of analytics, and I wouldn't be surprised if in a few more years they had standard analytics that most people use when they do stuff. We don't really have anything that's standard in our field, so we are at a disadvantage. In terms of a body of knowledge, training and corporate communications and public relations, all three have affirmative certification programs. All three, to have certification, you must have an approved body of knowledge. And so they all have bodies of knowledge. Now, how many people here are members of the American STC in addition to TCANs? Okay, a few of you. If you are, you read the STC literature, you see that there's this project to create a body of knowledge. And it's a very noble effort because they want to include the entire community. The problem is, after about 8 years of work, we still don't have a body of knowledge. And at this point, it becomes a problem. When we created the certification for STC, you're supposed to base it on the body of knowledge. We couldn't because there was no body of knowledge, so we had to create an alternate scheme for doing that. Control over the work. That's who, and this is from basic definitions of professions. Who has control over your work? Is it me or is it some other party? In technical communication, most of us do not have the final sign-off on our work. We have to go through a final approval, usually from a technical expert, which means that limits our control over our work. Credentialing. I have a question mark there. We have a brand new CPTC out there, and so that gives us some kind of advantage. What that means is that there is a credential to be had. The problem is it's brand new and we don't know what its track record is. Plus, there's a competitive credential from TCOM. Training has about 4 or 5 different credentials. I think that ultimately works against them. Only one of them is a national credential. 2 of them, excuse me, are national credentials. One in the UK and one in Canada. In the States, they have 4 or 5 different credentials, and I don't think that works for them. I think it works against them. However, our colleagues in business communication, or IABC, if you're familiar with them, they have a single credential. They're the world's largest group, and they that adds credibility to their work. And it's been around for about 20 years, which adds more credibility to their credential. The Public Relations Society of America has a similar credential. It's not quite as old as the IABC one, but it's still out there, and it is a benefit to them. In terms of demonstrating value, corporate communication is probably the best because they measure everything, and they have a means of measuring. We're very weak in the area of measurement, and there hasn't been any substantial work done in this area probably for at least 10 years, which is kind of disappointing. Training has some methodologies. They talk a lot about them. The good thing is, in terms of competition, they don't use their own methodologies. That's what's different about training versus corporate communication. Corporate communication, they measure everything. In training, they think about measuring everything, but then they don't do it. Alignment between industry and academia. I would say, for the most part, the academic preparation of technical communicators, it's okay, but when you look at some of the core professors in the field and what they're looking at, there's a real misalignment between what they're doing and what's needed out in the world, and that's a problem. You don't see quite as much misalignment in some of the other branches of communication that we compete with. In terms of reputation, I'm not talking about whether they have a good reputation or a bad reputation. My big question is do we even track our reputation? And the only field I know of that tracks its own reputation, not surprisingly, is public relations. And they generally find it's okay, but there are areas of suspicion. Clearly, it's not surprising. But if you know how people feel about you, you can then figure out what are the perceptions that are honest and appropriate, which ones are ones I'm not too comfortable with and I'd like to affect. And then that's how you target your campaign to change perceptions of you. And then a common voice. Public relations and corporate communications both have a common voice through a common professional association. IABC really speaks for the world, all communicators around the world, or most of them. Public Relations Society of America, even though it says America, they really do have a global voice. In TechCom, we now seem to have 2 voices for technical communication. TCOM, which is growing substantially, and STC. Right now, they're about similar in size. That has opportunities, but it has threats. One of them is that we don't have a common voice. So what are some of the threats to our brand? Just very, very quickly, we don't have any common methodology. We have really emphasized tools almost to a fault. And one of the reasons I say that is that we hire people based on their tool skills, not on their communication skills. And I see some people shaking their heads. And I remember talking to a retiring TechCom director years ago. And he said, I said, what would you do differently? He said, I always emphasize people's technical knowledge and their tools knowledge. And I think in the end, I really shortchanged my readers. And maybe I should have emphasized the ability to write. And I think that's probably where we will recover our reputation. Some of the rest of the stuff, I've talked about it. So I'm not going to add any more on that. But we talked about the negative. But I like what Steve said in his opening, because he said, we're optimists by nature. And I'd like to close kind of with some more optimistic thoughts. And first of all, there are opportunities for us. Certification can ultimately, it will not happen in the next 5 years, But over 20 or 30 years, if we can get the certification system worked out, it can affect entry into the field. But the problem is a lot of technical communicators don't even believe that there is certification feasible, or worse, they acknowledge that certification exists, but they don't buy into it. And then the challenge becomes, how do we speak with one voice? The body of knowledge, STC is working on it. I believe that there will be one, but I think it's going to take longer than I'd like. But the good news is that there will be one eventually. Control over work, certification over time will start to give us a little bit more autonomy in our work once we reach what's called a critical mass. And if you're wondering what's critical mass, it's about a third of the field, a quarter to a third of the field certified. And that usually takes about 20 to 30 years to make happen. There are other credentials that actually are more widely recognized because they're more niche areas of tech comm. The American Medical Writers Association has a very well-regarded certificate program. That means they've completed the educational requirements. They're about to launch a certification program. You've got the Bell certification, that's the Board of Editors in the Life Sciences, and you've got the TCOM certificate and the AMWA certificates as well. So, before I close, I want to ask you, based on all of this, what can you do, individually or collectively, to improve or strengthen the technical communication brand? How can you strengthen it? Yeah. Defining how we contribute. I think that's a really fundamental thing. What value do I provide? Me individually, me in terms of my group and my company, me in terms of the profession. I think that's probably one of the absolutely most fundamental things to deal with. So I appreciate that. Other thoughts? I see a lot of blank and scared looks. I didn't mean to frighten you. Yeah. Stop saying no. Find a way to make things happen. So focus on the yes, that positive, optimistic outlook. Other things? Yeah, Emma. Definitely market yourself in the organization. Absolutely. People aren't aware that you're producing something that they can benefit from and their customers can benefit from. Yes, way back in the back, Emma. I'm sorry, I didn't hear a word of that. It's too far away. I'm too old. Do everything you can to get the ear of the executives. Absolutely. You want executive-level sponsorship of your work. That doesn't mean you have to have everyday communication with them, but you want to know that they're your guardian angel behind you. And a really good guardian angel, it's a very infrequent interaction that you absolutely have to have. But when they do something nice, thank them, and every now and then let them know what you have to offer so they can be your guardian angel. Any other thoughts? Yes, take one more. Yeah, you. Definitely. Try to measure the work that you do to the best of your ability. There are case studies, there are examples to work from. I want to share a few thoughts in closing. One of the things that we can learn from is the successful rebranding of human resources, which used to be known as personnel. Do people still say nasty things about them? Let's get real, of course. But overall, the human resources profession is probably the most successful rebranding I have ever seen of what I call the social science or supporting professions. And what they did was they said, we're sick of being personnel, we're sick of being thought as the repository for all failed employees everywhere. We're sick and tired of being thought of as being clerks, and we're sick and tired of being treated like it. We're changing our name. And unlike the renaming of garbage collectors to sanitation engineers, people finally started getting the HR profession name. They launched a certification. It began in the late 70s. It's taken till the late 2000s for it to gain steam. 30 years, so it's a long-term effort. But by then, almost every organization had rebranded its personnel department as HR. I'd say about a third to a half of all HR specialists get certified, and most of them now get degrees from either a certified program, a recognized program, or through a continuing ed program that prepares them for that. You see chief human capital officers in organizations. And in fact, when the United States government was doing some reorganization in 2002, they required every federal government agency to have a chief human capital officer. And believe it or not, the number one thing they were told is you're supposed to measure. The really sad thing is they didn't do it, and that was a damning report that just came out from the government watchdog office. But still, they have a responsibility to do that. And I think that we can do that too in our field. And I want to start off with you as individuals, what you can do. At the very least, it's important for you to know what your profession is and become as capable as you can be, and be aware of the opportunities available and develop yourself. Because each one of you is an ambassador for the field. In addition, we've tried to rebrand our profession by different names. We've tried information development, content this, information that. The truth is that nothing is stuck. So unlike HR, if I were to make a recommendation on what we should do, I'd say just take pride in being a technical communicator. It's a great name. There's nothing wrong with it. It's something to be very, very proud of. In terms of the academics who prepare people for the field, I think it's really important for them to become better aligned. One of the ways is to work more closely with industry. Ideally, take some time off and actually do real technical writing so that they know what they're doing. And at the most, when they do research subjects, to look at things not about, analyzing a text to find out if it was, if all the I's were meaning this or if the I's meant that, but rather, looking at how people use content management. How does the process of integrating community input into documentation affect the quality of that documentation and the extensiveness of it? A lot of things I think are far more important for us to be looking at. For employers, number one, be a knowledgeable consumer of technical communication services. Know what your rights are. Know what you have it's reasonable to expect. Know how to hire a good tech writer. There's this wonderful horror story that I just read on LinkedIn last week about a guy who was hired in basically at a clerk's rate, and they really wanted him basically to do proofreading of documentation in a ridiculous period of time. And he quit at the end of 2 weeks, and the CEO, it's a tiny company, I was very unhappy with the work, and it was kind of like, well, the CEO should have been unhappy, because they're hiring like a communicator when they really didn't know what they wanted to hire in the first place, and they didn't even understand what they were trying to hire, which gets to the role of professional organizations. I can offer a suggestion. Number one, work together. Share material. If one has a body of knowledge, everybody should be able to share that body of knowledge. It shouldn't be one for Australia, one for New Zealand, one for Germany, and one for the United States and Canada. That makes no sense. We're a similar profession. The only thing that should be different is, are there different laws and customs in those particular countries that people need to be aware of? Beyond that, the core practice is the same. Second thing I recommend is get the credentialing issue resolved. We're not big enough that we can really afford to have a lot of competing credentials. So we need to come up with something that's consistent so that we can help employers better judge, which gets to the next one. We need to be outbound about promoting who we are. Even if all we can afford is to post material on our websites for prospective employers, for prospective customers of services, that's what we can do. And most of all, I think it's important for us to engage people and to make them enthuse people in the profession. As someone once told me many years ago, I was telling two people about my work. First one, they asked what I was going to do when I was about to go into the field of tech writing. And they said, I was telling them what I was going to do. They said, wow, that sounds incredibly boring. What a great way to start a career. Thank God I really didn't let that get in the way of my career. Flash forward 3 years later, and technology had sort of exploded during that time. And I was telling a cousin of mine what I did for a living. He goes, wow, that, and I was like, oh my God, not this again. He goes, that's really hard. And two things I learned. There are people out there that will respect our profession, and sometimes we don't even expect them to say something nice about us. So let's listen a little bit more, because we might be surprised by what we hear. That closes my presentation. I'm going to be sticking around for the next couple of days, so if you have questions, I'll be happy to take them privately over coffee break, over lunch, whenever, over the banquet tonight. But I want to thank, first of all, Emily for suggesting me, and Steve and his crew for bringing me over here. And I want to wish you all a wonderful conference, and I hope that some of the ideas raised now will be followed up with in the sessions that follow. Thank you.